So let's look at another example. This isn't an example that Kant discusses in the chapter, but it is a sort of well-known example. So suppose you're contemplating the moral status of slavery. You're thinking to yourself, yeah, I can't like to have some slaves. Is that something that I'm morally permitted to do, or does it conflict with a moral duty? So Kant says, look, what you want to do, formulate the maxim. So we formulate the slave owner's maxim, right? One ought to own other people, or one ought to own other people for the purposes of, subjecting their will to the fulfillment of your ends, say. And then you decide if enslaving people, that maxim could be an action that was made to be a universal instinct so that everybody, whenever possible, would go out and do that. Is that the sort of thing that all people could do to other people, and do that anytime it was possible? So specifically, you think to yourself, okay, is this a sort of action that everyone could take towards everyone else so that everyone becomes a slave? Well, no, that would be impossible. And we can see that it's impossible by just looking at how it would be inconsistent within itself. So the whole point of slavery is to gain the benefit of subjecting somebody else's will to the fulfillment of your own goals. That is, being able to order them around, benefit from their labor, etc. Now, if you're a slave, you lose not only the benefit of ordering somebody else around, but the benefit of determining your own actions. So you're no longer capable of working towards your end because you're taking orders, and you're no longer capable of ordering other people to work towards your end because you're taking orders. So the practice of slavery makes it impossible for you to be a master. If we try to make it a universal necessary instinct, then no one would get the benefit of slavery. Everybody would be a slave. Thus, the practice of slavery is internally inconsistent. And as a result of it failing the test of the universal will, we know that we have a perfect duty not to own slaves. And we can see this duty, the duty not to own slaves, as a sort of specific instance of another way that Kant formulates the categorical imperative. And this is a way that Rachel talks about when he talks about respect for persons. So the formulation that usually is associated with respect for persons says, act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never as a means only. So slavery is clearly in violation of this formulation. And the formulation sort of makes sense. What it says is all rational creatures are creatures that act towards ends. And therefore, if you treat somebody as a means, you treat them as though they don't have ends of their own, then you are in fact trying to act towards rational creatures in a way that denies their nature as a rational creature. Exactly the sort of thing you wouldn't want done to yourself. So what about the case of meritorious or imperfect duties? Now, in this case, right, we formulate our maxim, we test it according to the test of the universal maxim, and it's not self-contradictory. It's a sort of behavior, as expressed by this rule, that could be a universal instinct. Nevertheless, right, no one would consistently will the maxim. So in other words, if we imagine, would everybody will this to be a universal instinct? No one would do that. It wouldn't be possible for everybody to do that. So when we test for imperfect duties, we formulate the maxim describing the action, the reasons, the situation, decide if the action could be taken by all people towards all people at all times. If the action is universalizable in this way, it could be a universal instinct, then you ask, would you or anyone else always will the maxim as a universal law across all circumstances and times? So what you're really sort of asking is the motivation of your will consistent with everyone taking those actions in all circumstances towards everyone else. Now, if the maxim fails that, if you see situations where people would fulfill their desires, their goals by willing the maxim, in situations where willing the maxim actually goes against their will and desire in those circumstances, then it fails the test of the universal maxim. The will would be inconsistent, and hence the negation of the maxim that prescribes not doing that behavior, is an imperfect duty. It's something that you're not always obliged to do, but something that you should try to do, and that it's meritorious when you do it. So what are some examples of that? Well, an example that Kant talks about in the chapter is this idea of helping people who are in need when you're capable or able to do that. So we can imagine, say, Mr. Burns, and he thinks to himself, look, things are going great for me. Sure, I see other people struggling, but that doesn't affect me. So even though I can help them, I don't think I want to. And Kant says, well, suppose you test that action. Determine if you've got a duty to do or not do that. So we'll formulate that maxim. I should not bother helping people even though I can when I don't, in circumstances where they're in need. And Lisa here will point out, look, that is a violation of an imperfect duty. Why? Well, the world would continue on if everybody was a narcissistic, selfish jerk. Wouldn't be a great world, maybe, but it wouldn't completely undermine everything. So people who didn't help, if nobody ever helped needy people, society would still roll on. Not as good as it might be now, but it would still, it's consistent for everyone to behave that way. Nevertheless, right, you got to ask yourself, okay, so that's true, but would I always will that to be the universal instinct? Nobody ever helps anybody when they can, and the other person's in need. And you think to yourself, well, I wouldn't consistently will that, because when I'm in the position of Mr. Burns, when I am doing fine, don't need help, right, then I might will it. That might be the way I achieve my ends. But when I'm the person who needs help, right, I wouldn't will it that. And in fact, I realize that every human being has at least one period in their life, usually many, where they need help from other people. They're in need. At the very least, when you're a baby, you need help. People who are capable of helping you need to say, yes, I'll help you when you're a child, because you can't help yourself. So everybody has periods where they need help, and hence the will that would will, it's the universal instinct that you don't help people who are in need even when you can help them. That would be an inconsistent will, because sometimes that would speak to your ends, sometimes that would violate your ends. Let's look at one more, definitely not in the Kant chapter. So suppose that you're walking your dog takes a poop, you think to yourself, I really don't want to pick up this poop. They're, smelly and disgusting, and there's no one around to catch me. So am I morally allowed to do that, or am I going to violate some duty? So you put it to the test. All right. So you start with the universal maxim. You say, okay, is it possible that the maxim, don't pick up your dog poops because they're smelly and disgusting and repulsive and no one's around to watch you, if that were made a universal instinct, would it prevent people from doing it? Would not picking up dog poops prevent people from not picking up dog poops? Nah, it seems consistent. So it passes the test of the universal will, or the universal maxim, rather. Now you want to subject it to the test of the universal will. And so then you ask yourself, okay, would I always will this to be a universal instinct? Don't pick up your dog poops. Not just for me, but for everyone, right? And you think to yourself, well, no, because some situations that would fulfill my goals of not having to deal with the disgusting, gross, repulsive dog poop. In other circumstances, though, that would undermine my goals. If nobody picks up their dog poop, then in my neighborhood, it's not hard to extrapolate to a point where you imagine what the world would be like if that were true, then the idea that motivates that maxim, that you don't want to have to be exposed to or deal with this disgusting stuff, right? That would be, there would be situations where that would be impossible. So if nobody picks up the dog poop, there's dog poop everywhere. You're going to step in it sooner or later, sit down on it when you're in the park, roll over it with your car, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if the goal is to not have to engage in that unpleasant task because it's unpleasant, then if no one engaged in that unpleasant task because it was unpleasant, eventually it would just come back on us. So we couldn't consistently will that nobody picks up their dog poop. All right. So somebody's got to step up and do their job with this thing. It's an imperfect duty. The world is not going to be plunged into chaos if you don't always do it. All right. It's consistent as possible. Nevertheless, you wouldn't will that that's how everybody behaves all the time, because you know sooner or later you're going to wish that wasn't the rule.